2023 marks the 15th year in a row that South Africa has experienced rolling power outages that have cost the economy, households and businesses dearly. This year, in fact, the country is set to face 250 days of power outages at an estimated cost of around $13 billion US. At the same time, the need to address climate change, the single biggest challenge of our time right now, has become ever more urgent. Good day to you all and welcome to the CNBC Africa Special. I am Fifi Peters. In the next hour, we will be discussing how South Africa can power progress in its energy landscape. We'll be unpacking the policy shifts that need to happen to transform the country's energy mix to meet its climate targets in time. And we'll also outline the fiscal framework that needs to be in place to enable further investments to power South Africa's energy transition. Not to forget the interventions, the important interventions at that are needed to guard the social fabric of the country to ensure the energy transition is a just one that leaves no one behind. So I'm obviously not having this conversation alone. I am joined by a panel of experts to weigh in on this matter, and let's meet them.
Philip Cornell, Principal at Economist Impact. Themba Mkhwenazi, Regional Director, Africa and Australia at Anglo-American. And Salim Fakir, Executive Director at the African Climate Foundation.
So gentlemen, good afternoon to you all, and Themba specifically, thanks for joining me in studio.
Thank you.
It's nice to not be alone. Philip, I actually want to begin the conversation with you specifically, sir, because there is a lot of research right now out there on the just energy transition in Africa and South Africa specifically. Take us through the rationale of the economics impact to add to the research archive now, and exactly what it is that you explored.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Fifi, for having me on the program today. Look, South Africa, as you mentioned, is facing two realities. Ambitions to be net zero by 2050, but also a power sector that's clearly in crisis. As you mentioned, load shedding and blackouts are costing the economy, north of $50 million per day, because more than 40% of Eskom's generation is offline. And that kind of cost is increasing the chance of recession in the country by 45%. So achieving net zero requires that the country unlocks its renewable energy potential and transitions its energy sector. But that's also the key to addressing this supply crisis. So we've released our report, which is called Powering Progress, to explore how some of the regulatory and fiscal interventions need to evolve to better enable this just energy transition. It looks a little bit at how we got here, but more importantly, at this kind of regulatory landscape that's governing South Africa's electricity sector, and the gaps in the governing frameworks and financing opportunities, and those unique opportunities and risks that are associated with transitioning South Africa toward a low-carbon economy. So the crisis, as well as the need to accelerate the transition towards net zero, is really why this is timely at the moment. Sure. And of course, the justice of the energy transition is equally important. We see political resistance, but that stems from fear of negative effects that this transition could have on some groups, particularly where jobs are at risk. And so, this justice is looking at how do we offer affordable electricity, initiate corporate reforms, involve communities, and empower society while we're also protecting the environment.
Yeah, I mean, the point of justice is very important right now. Just this week, the World Economic Forum releasing its latest report on energy as well, just talking about the fact that progress globally, in fact, had actually plateaued. And although countries had made progress in increasing energy security, what was lacking was the justice element of it, and particularly as it did pertain to energy affordability of citizens all over the world. But Themba, to come to you now, particularly on this research, because Anglo did decide to back it. I mean, you could have just chosen from the many files of data that's out there right now, but you chose to back the reports and the data search and finding exercise that the Economist Impact went on. Why?
I think for us, we clearly understand that given the fact that as South Africa, we're very much at a crossroads in terms of the energy requirement. And again, this is very much around taking into account the fact that there's an issue around supply of energy. There's also the challenge around the need to reduce emissions. Coupled with that, the requirement to ensure that there's the provision of affordable energy, not just to businesses, but to obviously households and communities, and very much on the back of ailing infrastructure. So what we were keen on is supporting an independent study and research, which was very much based on engagement and collaboration, and engaging with people who would not necessarily be part of the interview process. So there's obviously quite a number of findings that are coming out of the report itself. So for us, the prospect of effectively being part of a study that essentially explores, this through the lens of what can be done from a regulatory and also what can be done also from a fiscal interventions in order to ensure that we have this enablement of the just energy transition in South Africa was very important to us.
Sure, and quite a number of individuals engaged in this report, regulators, activists, government officials, the private sector, as well as yourself, Salim. You were one of the contributors to the research here, and a 26-page document that really did make for interesting reading. But just in the interest of time, what do you reckon are the key highlights that our viewers who are watching this right now should know about the report being discussed right now?
Just to say a couple of things. I think the report is bringing together three areas that I think are fundamental to the discussion, which I think it does grapple with very well. The one is around energy security, and it's interlinked with economic recovery. And clearly, there is room for far more significant investments that we need to unlock in the energy sector per se. And I think the debate at the moment is, should it be more coal, should it be nuclear, gas, and renewables? If we wanted to do gas and nuclear and more coal, the state coffers are very depleted at the moment. So we have to look at other options beyond the state. We have to actually leverage the balance sheet of not only companies that can actually do this on their balance sheet, but also unlock other savings in pension funds elsewhere in the economy, and also create a conducive environment for perhaps people from outside who have savings that they want to invest in the South African economy. So the economic recovery, unlocking savings and new investments and energy security are interlinked. But we have another layer which we shouldn't forget. We are increasingly moving into a decarbonized world, and South Africa has to prepare for that. Just recently, the European Union has talked about carbon border tax adjustments, and that will affect our industry. If we look at the debates around AGOA, we can see the nervousness of the South African government if the US government sort of prohibits AGOA from being applied, which is the trade agreement that is a beneficial agreement for South Africa. But on top of it, the new AGOA trade agreement that will come through for African growth and development will have a carbon restriction component to it. We can make that assumption already, because the US is already putting in place legal mechanisms to say that if your carbon intensity is high, we are going to make you pay a penalty for that. And the European Union is already looking to implement that. So we actually have no way out of this but to decarbonize. And one of the quickest ways to do that is actually, and probably the most cheapest at the moment, is renewables. And we have to not only expand the scope of that using the balance sheet of private companies, households, and also worker savings, by the way, let's not forget that. But certainly municipalities are going to start playing a bigger role. So I think we're in the throes of a massive investment boom in energy. But there are some, of course, people who don't believe that change is necessary, trying to hold back. They say, you have, it's not only fossil fuels that we're dealing with, but also fossilized opinions on the process of change.
Sure.
Thanks.
Sure. A really nice statement there. But on the issue of renewables, it has been interesting to see as a result of the necessity in South Africa specifically, I mean, because of the power outages, the record power outages that we have experienced in the past 2 years specifically, since January, the increase in the huge surge in the amount of renewable installation from solar to wind, and we're only halfway through 2023, so one has to wonder what the point will look like in December. But following up on your point that you made, Salima, and I want to come back to you, Philip. So renewables very much a part of, or important part of the energy mix, particularly in future. Right now, according to the report, renewables are playing or contributing 11.9% or so to South Africa's energy mix. A bit of nuclear in there as well as diesel. The bulk remains coal. So I want to circle back to the point that you did make regarding the policy and what the research sought to find out in terms of the policy on the table right now, the most notable tools, the IRP plan and the REAP plan as well. You describe it as incomplete and outdated. So give us a little bit of color on that and why the policy on the table right now is not fit for purpose.
Sure, happy to. So, as you mentioned, look, the IRP has been the Integrated Resource Plan, has been around since 2019. There's an update that's still pending, but a lot of these policies, are almost outdated once they're enacted because the technology continues to move forward. So the review process that we're seeing on the IRP is siloed. I can mention one aspect of the IRP that should be updated, and that's particularly, we highlight in the report, removing the limit on local embedded generation procurement. So, freeing up independent generators to actually deliver more power to the grid. There's other parts also of the policy. You mentioned the REAP, and this is the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program. It's been around since 2011 and actually had some really good gains in the early years. Compared to the kind of growth in renewable energy we saw at the beginning of the last decade, it really did ramp up additions. But, this is based on a competitive tender scheme, an administered bidding process, and the high upfront costs for companies to get involved in that process, as well as the administrative and bidding costs and connectivity delays have contributed to actually slowing that uptake. The fourth round of this was delayed by several years. Now, what happened last year is that there was a scrapping of license rules for private generation and the allowance of private power purchasing agreements. And that added, just in the past year, something like 15 gigawatts of renewable energy to the pipeline. To put that in comparison, only a little bit like 6.3 gigawatts have been added under the REAP program since 2011. So, there's still maybe a role for the REAP. The experts that we talked to said maybe it should focus more on transmission, not in generation, where the private sector is clearly already very active and financing is much more available. And the last parts of the policy, that we think need to be updated are those kind of policies around unbundling this sector. There was an update to the ERA, and that's the Electricity Regulation Act last year, which has made a big difference. But it has yet to be implemented, some key aspects of that legislation. So, that looking to establish a competitive market with dynamic pricing, the signs are good, the direction is right, but we need to operationalize, for example, some of the regulating agencies and get that unbundling underway.
Okay. Themba, just your take on the policy on the table, because ultimately this is a policy that you as the private sector, yourselves as Anglo and perhaps even your peers in the sector have had to contend with. And I'd just like your take on whether it has been conducive and inviting for you to do a lot more in the renewables space in its current form, or whether you do think that it is in need of reform and perhaps modernizing.
Yeah. So, I would say whilst I accept that there are shortcomings, and Philip has done a very good job in terms of aligning and sharing that with us. What is very clear, though, is that the liberalization of energy generation is a really great example of how policy change can drive investment. And when we think about the significance of moving from the initial requirements of something like 10 megawatts to unlimited in a very short space of time, I mean, that change was epic and probably one of the largest policy reforms since the advent of democracy in this country 27 years ago. So obviously, it is very much work in progress. But we've also got to acknowledge that, finally, obviously the private sector had a lot to do with urging government, but the sanity prevailed and we're where we're at. I also need to acknowledge, though, that even within government, and in particularly in the presidency, with the current Minister of Electricity, who at the time obviously was working within the presidency, he played a significant role in terms of the debottlenecking of some of the constraints. So, for example, as Anglo-American, in partnership with EDF and through Envusa, we are in the process of creating a renewable energy platform of between 3 to 5 gigawatts of energy, which is a combination of solar and wind energy. And at some stage, there's the option for pump storage. And that obviously is part and parcel of the 10 gigawatts of renewables that, for example, the mining industry has put up as projects. I do agree with Philip, though, that there has to be a shift now where we need to look at transmission, because it's all well and good us having the capacity and the capability to deliver on the projects, but getting those electrons to the customers or the end users, it requires a different approach to the current infrastructure, as an example. But, the long and short of it all, I would probably say, is that we are making progress, and that's a good thing. And we're certainly a lot further than we were, say, 12 to 18 months away, which is a good thing.
Sure. Points taken. And Salim, perhaps to bring you in to dovetail on the comments that Themba did make, particularly around the liberalization of our renewable energy markets, when the threshold and the cap of how much private producers could produce was lifted and it was free for all. We do know that that did come at a time when our backs were against the wall as a country because of the record power cuts that were made. And I did find it really interesting that you argue in the report that policy change shouldn't come as a result of having no other choice. I mean, we can be a little bit more proactive in suggesting some tools and policy frameworks that can accelerate the energy transition at pace. So what would you add in terms of a policy on the table right now, and what can be addressed or perhaps polished a bit more to ensure that further changes happens at pace?
So I think it's first to say that these discussions on reforms have been happening for the last 2 decades. They're not new. I think we've waited too long and we actually waited for a crisis to happen for policy reforms to be pushed. The good thing is that we have almost all hands on deck at the moment, because the government, particularly the presidency, with Operation Vulindlela, has a special committee to look at, it's called NECOM, and I forget the acronym, but is designed to actually speed up the process of reform. Lots of them have been mentioned by Philip and Themba, but I would say the most urgent one is really to make sure the transmission operator is up and running. NERSA has to issue a license, and we have to begin the process of actually building more grid capacity. The crucial thing is that we have to, in order for more renewables to be built at utility scale. We actually we need more grid capacity where the wind and solar resources, which is not at where the coal mining or coal plants are, although there is some room for that. For example, we could maximize the utilization of old coal plants that actually have to be shut down over time. We can repurpose them to use the existing infrastructure, obviously decontaminate the land and use the land for building out more renewables as rapidly as we can. The second area I would say is that we do definitely need a new integrated resource plan that should be a little bit more open to rapid expansion of the cheapest source of energy. And for now, it will be renewables, there's no doubt about it, and shouldn't put a cap on it. And thirdly, I think we should empower municipalities to play a bigger role. I would say the biggest concern for me is in these reform processes, particularly with embedded generation, we got to look at, because largely the municipalities have relied on electricity sale for generation of their income. We've got to relook at those revenues and how municipalities would be made continue to generate revenue from some source, including from embedded generation. And secondly, I think the crucial point is we should not forget the importance of the inequality of access to electricity in South Africa. Richer people can afford to pay up to limit, of course, middle class and upper middle class cost of electricity, but poorer people, even though they have access to electricity, many of them can't afford to pay it. And in fact, even if there's connections, especially metered connections, if the costs are prohibitive, they would elect not to use electricity. So this is an area in the transition process to rapidly expanding a liberalized model. We actually have to look at other elements of the social and socioeconomic side of delivering this, that we don't lose track of that as well.
Sure. So let's then focus on the points that all three of you have emphasized in terms of the move away from the private sector playing a role only in generation right now and playing a greater role in transmission. And Salim, you mentioned points like ensuring that building a sufficient grid capacity would need to be in place. You mentioned points around ensuring that we repurpose old power points. Our older power plants, all points, in my view, that will require money. And so if we move to the fiscal framework, then that will be needed to support this just energy transition. We're not starting from zero, Philip. 2021, COP 2021 was a pretty successful one for South Africa in that we didn't come back home empty-handed. $8.5 billion is what we returned with as a result of the commitments by some external partners on the just energy JETP, the Just Energy Transition Partnership. $8.5 billion, not small change, but certainly not the ocean of money that we need in terms of the $97 billion that's needed for South Africa in the next 5 years to fund the energy transition. So just help us understand your thinking of how we can plug the funding gap.
Sure, absolutely. And the funding gap is serious. I mean, the government has estimated, as you mentioned, a $97 billion price tag over the next 5 years. The National Business Initiative has estimated the cost of transition by 2050 to over $320 billion US. So although those amounts are very large, we've talked about the opportunity costs of delays in addressing the energy crisis. Salim mentioned a little bit about upcoming policies in other parts of the world that will make South Africa less competitive if they don't adopt lower emissions power sources. But of course, just the daily and yearly cost of the shortfalls that we're seeing already are serious. So, we need to think about how we can structure viable investment pathways and tap into financing opportunities. A lot of times that can come out of the local capital markets in South Africa, which are liquid and which are being actively used to drive investment, particularly into renewable generation. But South Africa also needs to leverage those international partnerships like the JET-P, which you mentioned. So 8.5 billion, it's only about 9% of the total funds that we need to cover the just energy transition. So the point is, how do we use those funds? They're not just for investment, they're for grants and concessional loans. They're meant to leverage further private sector funding by de-risking some of the potential investments from private investors. So, those kinds of international funds to leverage more private sector investment are important, whether it comes from the JET-P, whether it comes from multilateral development banks or financial institutions. And by the way, the South African government can explore its own range of financing options, including blended finance and public-private partnerships, that have worked so well in, cases like toll roads is one that, some of your viewers might be familiar with. But, the Development Bank of South Africa, the DBSA, also does invest directly into renewable energy projects. So a little bit of public funding can go a long way to leveraging and incentivizing a lot of private sector funding, both domestically and internationally.
Mm-hmm. I just want to say we've had success with some toll roads. There's a certain one in Gauteng, the economic capital of the continent, that didn't quite go well. But that's a conversation for another day. So Themba, to talk about the money aspect with you as well. So in reference to the funding that we did get from our international partners, Nazmira Muller of 91 actually makes a really nice point to say that, right? So that 8.5 billion, it's a mix of concessional loans and grants and investment guarantees and the like. But she did note that the rate of the concessional loan is not as favorable as what South Africa would be able to get if we tapped into and exercised the capital markets a lot more. She also makes the point around the public-private partnerships, and that's what Philip has also just spoken about right now. And what do you think about PPPs as Anglo, and what kind of framework would need to be in place for you to partner with government with such big money that's required?
Yeah, I mean, we are very supportive of the notion around PPPs, because it's an opportunity, obviously, to combine the government guarantees for power purchases with private sector financing and technical expertise, where we believe as the private sector, we obviously play a key role. And in fact, we are of the view that the PPPs will play a critical role in advancing the transition to the next stage.
Sure.
So it's really crucial. Now, we of course, through, for example, the arrangements that we have as business in South Africa through BUSA and Business for South Africa, we also have established the Resource Mobilization Fund, the RMF, and this was established by Business for South Africa. And obviously the RMF very much serves as a way for local businesses to support the implementation of the Energy Action Plan, and it embodies the necessary collaborative approach. And again, I really do need to stress the significance of collaboration between government and, of course, our social partners. And in fact, to that end, Anglo American has already donated about 10 million rand to the RMF, which will be used to provide, obviously, the technical support and the ability to capacitate NECOM as an example. Key and central, though, in all of this is policy reform, because we've actually seen and shown that, with policy reform, you can actually drive for further investment. And this, for us, is going to be quite crucial, because, the partnerships that we have with government, we've actually seen as well that they can actually speed up the room for change and speed up, the necessary trajectory around the reform. Because at the end of the day, it is very much around how do we build an inclusive economy from which South Africa can benefit for all its people as well. But of course, in order for us to be able to achieve this as well, there needs to be laser-like and flawless execution. And in particularly as well, in terms of the 3 immediate priorities, which we've obviously engaged with government on, and we have the support as well of the presidency around improving logistics performance, dealing decisively with crime and corruption, and of course stabilizing energy supply, which is quite paramount.
I'm glad that you actually did mention the issue of policy reform, because I was going to say, for any kind of PPP to work, the policy framework needs to be agreeable for both parts.
Absolutely.
Probably early days right now, but in terms of what agreeable does look like, in terms of PPPs, care to share any comment, or is this a conversation for another day?
No, look, I think, as I say, I mean, I think it's very much a work in progress, and I think part of the work in progress is also largely attributable to government having a much better understanding as well as to what is the appropriate framework around the triple Ps and how should this be approached. I mean, we have views in terms of how this needs to be done. They obviously also have to get their heads around that. But I think what is something that we are all unequivocally aligned with is that we do need a different approach, which is why liberalization is paramount, and the platform of triple Ps as a way in which then we use that, as I had said earlier, as a form of, providing capital as well to the government guarantees for the power purchase agreements.
Sure. Salim, at the top of your your comments, you mentioned the idea around pension money. And I was hoping that perhaps you can unpack that. Just pension money in terms of contributing to the funding gap right now. What did you mean by that, and what role do you reckon the funds of mine workers or all stakeholders in this industry right now could contribute towards financing the just energy transition?
So firstly, I would say that most people would recognize the 8.5 billion deal that we have. It is still cheaper than borrowing compared to the open market, where if you wanted to raise a foreign denominated bond, it's still much cheaper than actually South Africa borrowing from the global markets. But what is important is that to recognize that when we ran the renewables IPP process, we were able to mobilize substantial domestic funding without actually climate finance deal, and to the tune of about 19 billion. Some of it would be in the form of equity, because companies who are participating would have put in some equity funding, but most of the borrowing came from local commercial banks. And there were also substantial amount from, for example, the DBSA, IDC, and some of it was raised through the issuing of bonds in which pension funds could participate in. Then we have, for example, the Government Employment Pension Fund and its investment arm, the PIC, which then also took stakes in a lot of the renewable programs. They invest anyway in companies on the listed market. They invest in South African state enterprises, etc. So there is utilization of that, and I think it's called Regulation 28 also allows for some leeway for pension funds to invest in long-term infrastructure programs, because not all investors want to stay for 15 or 10 years or 20 years. someone to actually exit earlier. Pension funds are ideal for long-term infrastructure investment, particularly things like transmission infrastructure and so on. So I do think there's room for that. We commissioned a study with Intellidex, which is available on our website. We've looked at other sources of funding that we can mobilize on the back of the JETP. The usefulness of the JETP is that it allows for combination of a partnership with South African international partners and global investors to have confidence that there's a structured investment process around the transition. And that also helps with the confidence that, provided we have a very good operational plan to move forward. Nazmira also did say that, it wasn't the JETP at the moment because it's not, we have to see how it's operationalized. If it's not operationalized, it could be, her word was useless, although I don't believe it's useless. I think there are other elements to the JETP that go beyond finance that we also have to take into account. And I think there's lots of room for a structured investment plan to move forward. Lastly, I would just say that the challenge we have at the moment is that given that South Africa has taken almost half of the Eskom's debt into the fiscus or the sovereign, there has been a ban imposed or moratorium imposed on the ability of Eskom to borrow. So we have to figure out how some of these loans that have been raised by the JETP and any other type of debt structure for financing other infrastructure programs that are assets or under the rubric of Eskom, how we can unlock that, given that Eskom can't actually borrow at the moment for the next 3 years, as I understand it. So there are some challenges at the moment, despite the fact that we have this funding available.
Okay. Salim, can I address something that I didn't see in the report? And the headlines around the world will refer to it as the $100 billion broken promise of climate finance, obviously making reference to a promise that developed nations made almost a decade, in fact over a decade ago, to help developing nations who are more vulnerable to climate change and its effects, but are not the bigger perpetrators in contributing towards the damage. So the $100 billion US dollar promise that was made to channel $100 billion US dollars each year by 2020, a promise that has not been lived up to. Where do you see developed nations having to play a role to finance some of our mitigation and adaptation strategies to also alleviate the pressure that we have to plug the funding gap, a funding gap that many would argue is not entirely as a result of the country alone?
You want me to respond to that?
Please.
So historically, I think under the Paris Agreement, there's a thing called common but differentiated responsibility. It's a principle. It means that people who have utilized for the advancement of the economies, the carbon budget, and who have created a liability, if you want, for those who have underutilized the carbon budget, they have a responsibility to provide the cheapest sources of finance, if not even grants, which is on the basis of the whole idea of the JETP. And they have promised to raise per annum up to 2020 and beyond 100 billion. And none of that 100 billion has been forthcoming to the full capital requirements that are necessary. But and remember, the 100 billion has to be split with many countries, both dealing with climate risk in the form of what is called adaptation, and the other is to deal with emission reductions in developing and emerging countries. People are talking about a new target. People are if you follow the Paris debates a week ago, which was organized by President Macron, there is now talk of a fundamental reform of the entire public finance and private allocations architecture to make sure that the development finance institutions can play a bigger role through increased capitalization of their funding in supporting transitions everywhere in the world, because we need trillions. We 100 billion is not enough.
Sure.
But countries like South Africa, which have mature capital markets, have some luxury to be able to exploit our own resources. But we should be asking the international community that have signed up to the multilateral Paris Agreement that they, in order for us to raise our ambition in terms of our climate ambition, some level of support would be required from the international community, which is basically what the JETP did. The beauty of the JETP is that it unlocks a lot more money outside of the usual multilateral system, because it allows for bilateral engagements around a large structured investment plan to get to net zero. And so that's the real beauty of it. We have now Senegal, we have Indonesia and Vietnam that have onboarded JETP ideas. And basically the idea came from South Africa. It didn't come from the International Partners Group. It was originated here. And so it's a useful device to unlock far more funding than would be possible through a very cluttered, bureaucratic and cumbersome process of trying to get funding out of the global green funds that exist.
All right.
So that's just my view on that. Thanks.
All right. No, I appreciate it. I appreciate you taking the question. So far, gentlemen, we have addressed some of the policy shortfalls, and you have given your respective recommendations as to what needs to potentially be done to ensure that the tools are a little bit more modern. We've addressed a bit of the fiscal framework that also needs to be fine-tuned a little bit to address the large funding gap, but to finance the energy transition. So I want to finish off by looking at the just part of the equation, and that is the social fabric part of the equation. And Themba, perhaps starting with you here, because unions are scared, and as a result they are fighting tooth, nail and thumb to ensure that their workers, the 90,000 workers presently right now in the coal industry, are not left behind by rhetoric that says that coal is out and solar and wind is in. You're a former coal man, you veteran in the industry, as it were, but should there be this level of fear and pessimism around the energy transition?
I would say there shouldn't be fear. Obviously, that fear is derived from uncertainty. There should, of course, be, though, a commitment. And, for example, companies like us are very much committed to the just transition. And I think more broadly, there is consensus that the transition must be just, delivering equitable gains for all South Africans. Now, of course, this is a mammoth task, as you have highlighted, Fifi, but it needs to be planned, though, incisively, helping bring about, obviously, this affordable electricity, but also involving the empowerment of communities in power generation and protecting the environment at the same time as well. And of course, from a South African context, the other challenge is that we need to do all of this while addressing some very deep economic and social deficits. So therefore, as you quite rightly say, we do need to ensure that, when we think about the potential decline for very real life industries, such as obviously the coal sector, we must do this by supporting those that are affected through this transition. And we need to look at how does the new energy generation provide opportunities in terms of, obviously, employment as well. But again, our view is that this requires a national collective effort and strong partnerships between government and business. And what's really important as well, because it also is embedded in this Powering Progress title, is that there must be a real desire and a move from theory to action, you know, because if that happens, then we are able to address and attract investment. And I do want to, for example, you know, just use one small example from the report that Philip, you know, has been part and parcel of. You know, one of the most crucial findings in that report and research is the importance of creating timely social policies that ensure the just transition. And then particularly with a focus on the affected groups, such as the youth in South Africa. We know that we sit with a very, very high youth unemployment. And this, you know, is what embracing a just energy transition is all about, because it's about delivering equitable gains while transforming energy systems that are built on inclusive principles. And that feedback, you know, which obviously came out of that research, is really key around those pretty creative and timely social policies.
Sure, sure. Philip, to bring you in here, you also looked at the province of Mpumalanga, just given the fact that the biggest coal deposits are there, and perhaps the work is most likely to be affected in the short term, in short to medium term perhaps, or even there. So just talk us through that, and perhaps some of the recommendations as how to soften the blow as much as possible for workers who may have their jobs and their livelihoods on the line.
Sure, absolutely, Fifi. I think Temba really made some good points there about what's required from a policy perspective to smooth that transition. Mpumalanga, as you mentioned, I mean, is South Africa's coal country. More than 80% of coal jobs and coal production happens in that region. So the question is, what do we do with the workers and with the facilities? So, for example, directly supporting transitioning coal workers will require sometimes direct support and income assistance, but certainly reskilling. And that's, you know, directly linked also with what we're doing with the facilities themselves. So as we think about how we repurpose some of these mines, you know, restoring and rehabilitating mine sites are going to require labor and create employment in themselves. That can absorb some of the workers that are maybe facing redundancies from closures of those mines. You know, we need to make organized labor in this area directly invested in the future of the green economy. Celine was talking a little bit about, you know, what we do with investing pension funds. Well, investing pension funds from coal workers and from those kind of labor groups and organized labor groups can really make them invested in transitioning the green economy. And, you know, we talked a bit about NECOM, the National Energy Crisis Committee. Well, NECOM and also NEDLAC, which is the National Economic Development and Labor Council, have played crucial roles in terms of dialoguing with the stakeholders in those vulnerable areas in order to prepare them, to make them aware of what's available in terms of support, and to try to mitigate some of that fear that might be present in vulnerable labor areas. You know, there are 90,000 coal jobs at risk. But the opportunities in the new energy economy vastly outweighs that, as long as we can handle how we transition those workers and do reskilling. So, for example, the JETP, which we've talked a lot about, a recent report estimated that as many as 1 million jobs might flow from the growth in renewable energy created by the JETP by 2050. And that's more than 3 times the jobs that are projected to be lost. So the numbers look good, but it's all about how do we manage that reskilling and make sure that the affected communities also are the ones that can benefit from this change down the road.
And especially just given the fact that this transition has to happen in an economy that already has a record number of people who do not have jobs. And so the fear of being thrown into that unemployment line is a really real one right now, particularly for people who perhaps are you earn one salary and your salary has to take care of around 4 people in your household. But Salim, to bring you in here, because so perhaps jobs are at risk today, but tomorrow, a whole lot more jobs stand to be created as a result of the transition. In the interim, so the report makes a case for some kind of income support, financial support in the interim to act as a buffer while that transition happens. And I'd just like your thoughts on that and how we pay for that, just given the fact that even right now, we're still trying to find the rands and cents for a basic income grant. So then where will the rands and cents for this supporting income buffer come from as we transition, in your view?
I think, firstly, just to say that, as you had pointed out, there are very good and legitimate reasons why unions are concerned. I would not say that unions are resisting transitions. In fact, the just transition notion came out of the labor movement in the 70s in the US, and the International Labor Organization has a special center that deals with, it's called the Just Transition Center, which is looking into this into more detail. The labor union is also very active with the Presidential Climate Commission, and there's a lot of detailed work going on around the very question that you mentioned. Where would the jobs come from? Because the displacement of a coal miner doesn't necessarily mean that that miner would necessarily be working in a renewables company or in a renewables operation, because most of the renewables would be dispersed across the country. So that's the risk that they, of course, fear. The second is that we have to look at, before we even give grants and so on, we should look at what can be done in the interim to soften the blow, particularly for workers that are likely to be displaced. And we must be clear that this displacement process is not going to happen overnight. It's going to take quite a while, maybe 10, 15 years. Most of the workers, we have to look at the age of the workers. Most of them will naturally exit. And then the problem is that we've got to replace the dearth of employment in in an area that have high levels of unemployment with new kinds of jobs that doesn't only involve the green sector or renewables, but we have to look at the whole development model of Malanga. The government would be very opposed to monetary transfers. They would want to look at other things. But this is not something that we should take off the table. We should actually look at this very carefully. If we bias it for certain types of workers, why not other workers in other parts of the country that are going to be hit by other decarbonization trends, particularly in the car industry or the steel industry, which are also going to be subject to transition risk. It's not just the coal sector. We need to recognize that. So we have to take a whole economy approach. We have to understand that coal phase out is not going to happen overnight. It's going to have to be a managed process. We have to bring workers on board. We've got to create investment that can rapidly create jobs broader than the coal sector. And we have to define a new development agenda for the coal mining areas that go beyond coal mining. There's also critical minerals and other areas that will evolve. And then lastly, I think if there is a form of grant support, or income support, it has to be designed to uplift and create new capabilities. So there could be, for example, an office reskilling, but the grant could be to actually support maybe things like enterprise development and other opportunities. So we have to think through this. There's a lot of ideas. In fact, I would just say there's a second study that we've actually commissioned, which would be worth your viewers to look at, which is also an Intellidex study that looks at some of these kinds of issues in a little bit more detail.
All right.
But lastly, I don't think we should exclude that as an option, but let's be careful how we do it.
All
Thanks.
right. Yeah, no, feel free to bring that research our way. We'd certainly like to discuss it a lot more. I have certainly enjoyed the conversation that has unfolded in the past almost hour. A lot has been said. A lot hasn't been said, but unfortunately we've got 4 minutes left to wrap it up. So I'm just going to give each of you an opportunity to briefly wrap it up for us in terms of your concluding remarks as to what you think is the most important takeaway to leave with the viewers. And perhaps, Themba, I'll begin with you, sir.
Thank you. So for us at Anglo American, we are committed to playing our part. And we also recognize that the world cannot decarbonize without the many minerals and the metals that we produce. But we also recognize that we also need to do our part as well in terms of minimizing the emissions related to the supply of those minerals. So we accept the role that we play in supporting the decarbonization of the value chain. And what we say is that everything that Anglo American does in South Africa is very much around playing our part to the transition of this new economic future. And what's quite an imperative for us as well is that success in South Africa is very much tied to also success for us as Anglo-American, because South Africa's future is very much our future. So what I would really say then is that, in addition to the jobs, the opportunities and the businesses that arise from the supply of clean and affordable power, it is undeniable that obviously the increased grid capacity and stability will also attract new investment to South Africa, whilst also obviously furthering its ambitions for decarbonization. There is a window of opportunity for South Africa, and collectively we must work with agency and pace. That's really, really key, with obviously tangible actions that demonstrate to all South Africans that everything can be done to address the 3 national priorities. And I would probably say that if we do this, we ensure that our country prospers in the long run. And I've got to say that access to clean energy, reliable energy, is foundational to this prosperity.
Couldn't agree more. Philip, Salim, 2 minutes left to wrap up between the two of you. So Philip, I'll just to begin with you in terms of your concluding thoughts.
Thanks very much, Fifi, and thank you very much for having me in this conversation. I guess what I would just finish with is, we've been talking about how do we manage this transition, and those are really important issues in terms of making sure that it's a just process. But at the end of the day, a transitioned net zero clean energy economy will lead to more affordable, more resilient, and more reliable services and energy for the energy consumers and for the population of South Africa. It will create employment and it will lower costs, for consumers by hundreds of millions of dollars across the economy. So, where we're going is to the right place that is more affordable and better for everybody, that creates more employment. It's just how we manage this process to get there, which is crucial. And that's what we need to get right to make sure that we maintain popular support for the transition. Any kind of idea of a trade-off between affordable energy and clean energy is ultimately a false one.
So 12.8 billion rand then is what the report has calculated in terms of the net savings by 2030 for residential consumers if 11 gigawatts of rooftop solar PV is installed. I certainly look forward to that saving. My electricity bill is strangling me right now. But Salim, your final thoughts, so we'll give you the last word.
So firstly, I think we need to obviously see this with open eyes. There's a risk, and we have to be pragmatic about the process of change. But I would say that the risk of not doing anything sooner will be higher as we go forward. And we could actually have far deeper crisis than we currently have. And I don't think we want to be in that situation if we're feeling already the pain that we have. And we have to be sensitive to lots of many other dimensions. We can't, we have to couple the transition to net zero and decarbonization with also a fundamental balanced socio-economic and economic recovery process. As they say, we ought not to leave anybody behind, and we should really measure ourselves on the basis of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, it is certainly about creating shared value. Everyone certainly has an important role to play to ensure that that shared value is created. It has to be a win-win for all. After all, there is only one planet Earth. So we've got to get it right. But gentlemen, that wraps up our conversation for today on how South Africa can power progress in its energy landscape. I'd like to thank all of you. Philip Cornell, the Principal of Economist Impact, Salim Fakir, the Executive Director for African Climate Foundation, as well as my in-studio guest, Mr. Themba Mkhwanazi, Regional Director for Africa and Australia at Anglo American. Until next time, it's goodbye.